Welcome to this exciting video series where I'm going to show you how to turn GPT-4 into a lucrative SaaS platform. Dive in as we uncover the potential to monetize this AI giant. So we're going to run npm init to initialize a new project. I'm going to have -y in there just to automatically say yes to all of the questions. Next up, we want to install some dependencies. To run this, we do npm I, and we're going to be installing body parser, cause.env, express, OpenAI, and also UUID v4. So let me explain what we're doing here. So body parser is so we can pass JSON back in the body. Cause is to protect our API. .env so we can read from a .env file. Express is what we're going to be building the API upon. OpenAI obviously is the OpenAI SDK, and UUID v4 allows us to create a unique identifier for each of the users. So let's open up the package.json file. We can check that they're installed. OpenAI have recently updated to version 4. This works slightly different to how version 3 works, but we've got that covered in this tutorial. So from here, I'm just going to create the skeleton of the application. So let's create an index.js file. This is where our main content for the API is going to go. We'll also create an index.html file. This is for us for testing. And I'm going to create a new folder, and that folder is going to be called external. That folder will have a few folders in it. One will be called CSS. The other will be called images. And lastly, the other one will be JS. So this is where we're going to store our files for external use. We'll make those accessible inside the index.js file. We also want to create inside of the main one here, we want to create a new file called .env. And that's where we're going to have our API key from OpenAI. This is the key that we want to give it, OpenAI _API _key. You can get this key from the OpenAI website, and that's everything we actually need inside the .env file. So let's start creating the actual API. So what we want to do is we want to say const OpenAI is equal to require, and then we want that just to be OpenAI. Next we have express. And that's going to be equal to require express, and then body parser is equal to require body parser. Cause will be equal to require cause, and then we're going to have a const with a UUID, and that's going to be equal to require UUID v4. So to use the .env file that we've created, we need to require .env.config, and that will look for this .env file here. If we had the env file inside the external, for example, we wouldn't, but if we did, we could then put some configuration in here to tell it where that env file is, but automatically it looks in the root folder for a .env file. Next, let's tell it which port we want to use, so we'll create a constant called port, and that port will be equal to process.env port or port 5000. So this is important when we upload it because sometimes server companies will include a port inside the env file that they have automatically on their server. So next we want to initialize the app. So we say const app is equal to express. And then we want to start telling the app to use some middleware. So app.use. And first of all, we're going to use body parser.json. And then we're going to tell it to start using cause. And then what we want to tell it to do is to this external file here, we want to provide those as static files. So we're going to say app.use, then express.static. And this will just be external. Then we can use these files as if this was a standard HTTP server. That's all the importing done. We now need to set up some configuration for OpenAI. To do this, we say const OpenAI is equal to new OpenAI. And what we want to do is pass in a object here. It's going to be API key, and then the process.env OpenAI key that we have inside of our environment file. just going to copy that to make sure it is correct. So from here, I like to have just a route that I can access, which is just an empty route. And what I like to do is just res.send that the server is up and running. So res.send, welcome to the Coding Nexus API. And that just lets me know that if I try to go to the API on an empty path, it's going to come back with welcome to the Coding Nexus API. Next up, we're going to create an endpoint for new users to get their IDs. So we say app.get, and this will be called new users. So the path new user, that's going to take in a request and a response. And that will just res.send. I'm going to send back an object, and that will be UUID, and that will be equal to a UUID. So we'll test these after we create all of the endpoints. Next one we want is a post request, so app.post. And this one will be for a message. So we do a path of message. And this is going to be an asynchronous endpoint, so async. And that will take in a request and return a response. And then from here, we can create our connection to OpenAI. So const response is going to be equal to await openai.chat.completions.create. And inside here, we reference the model that we want to use. So the model we'll be using will be the GPT-4. And then we need to just reference the messages it's going to be sent across. So the messages will be an array, and that will have an object with a role. That role will be user. And the messages that we want to send across, so the content, will be the request.body.message. And then we can close this off, and then we can start sending that message to the user. To do that, we say res.send. We're going to create an object called message, and that's going to have a response.choices. I'm going to take the first option from the choices. That will have a message, and then we send the content from that. So once we've done that, we can close off that endpoint, and then we just need to tell the application to start listening on a port. So we say app.listen, and then we're going to take in that port number that we had, the one that we referenced up here. That will go into there. Then we're just going to console log that the server is running on that specific port. We can hit save. So let's now test this. So we can run node dot, and we can see that our server is running on port 5000. If we open up a browser, you can see that if we go to localhost port 5000, we have our welcome to the Coding Nexus API. We can also open up Postman and type in localhost 5000/message on a post request. Insert some body content, so that will be an object with a message and the message that you want to send. If we hit submit on that, that should send the message off to OpenAI, and it will come back with a response for us. So this is using the GPT-4 model. If you want it to be slightly quicker, we can change it down to the DaVinci model or even the 3.5 Turbo model. So that's everything actually on the API side that we need to do. Next up, let's have a look at this index.html file. So this is going to be quite a simple one. What we're going to do is just have HTML, and then we're going to have a head. This is where it's going to inject some of the information. Don't forget, this is just for testing. This is just, let's say this was an example of a client's website. And then we want to link to a script file. That script file will be src, and that's going to link to HTTP, localhost, port 5000, and then we're going to have the JS and then main.js. So when we test this later, we can open up this index.html file. It will reference a main.js file that we're going to create in here, main.js. And then from this main.js, we'll start injecting information into this HTML file. I'm just going to add a title in here as well. Sample site. Okay, so that's everything that needs to be done there. This index file is done. So the reason we included the images file is just in case you wanted to pull your logo in to show inside of the chatbot. I don't think we're going to be doing that in this tutorial, but you can do if you like. So for the main.js file, I'm going to copy some content across and then explain what the content is as we do this. So the first thing we're going to do is create a couple of variables. So the first one is URL elements. This is going to take the elements from the URL. So for example, if we wanted to have a mini chatbot in the bottom corner, or whether we wanted to have a full screen chatbot. So we could use the URL elements for that. In this example, we'll be using a mini one, but you will be able to expand that out to a larger full screen one just by changing the type in the URL from mini to full and adding a little bit of CSS. The API domain, this is the domain that we have here that we start when we created index.js. You'll need to change this if you host it to the hosted domain. Up next, we have a function to get those variables from the URL. So inside here, what we're doing is we're getting all of the scripts that are on the actual page. We're then going to filter that by our particular script, which would be called main.js. If you're using this in the wild, you may want to name this to something more obvious. So maybe the name of your company or something different, just a random string. And then we're taking the first instance from there, because if you change that to the random string or your company name, that should be the only one that exists there with that name. And then from there, we're getting the src, so the actual link. And then we're going to split that link by the question marks and the and symbol. We're going to take the first one after the question mark, and then we're going to split it by the and symbol. And then what we're going to do is we're going to loop over each of these splits here in this for each, and we're going to get the elements. When we're going to convert all of those element variables into a lowercase element. And then what we're doing here is we're actually going to create an object and inject it into this URL elements here. And we're going to get the key to lowercase, and then we're going to get the actual type to lowercase as well. So we're going to set this to lowercase just in case a user decides that here they're going to have main.js question mark type is equal to 4. So we're just protecting ourselves just in case that happens. And then that should insert something into the URL elements, something like type is equal to mini. But we're trying to make this as automated as possible. So the next thing we want to do is inject our style sheet. So to do that, we create this new function called add styles. So that's going to get the head element, and we're going to create a new link inside of the head element. I'm going to give that link a rel of style sheet, a type of text/CSS, and then we're going to give it an href of the API domain that we have here, /css/styles.min.css. And then at the end, we're going to append that on. So that's going to automatically inject our own style sheet into the person's document. So up next, we have the functions that are actually going to create the chatbot window. So there's two functions here. We have create element, and we also have create chatbot window. So I'll go through the create element one first, because this one relies heavily on this one. So this create element takes a type, an ID, a class name, the parent element, and any text that needs to go into there. And then what we're going to do is we're going to get the document, and we're going to create an element based on the type. Then from here, we're just going to go do a few if statements to say if the ID exists, we're going to give the element.id the ID. And then for each of the class names, we're going to add that to a class list. So this class name is an array. And then if text, then what we're going to do, the inner HTML will be equal to the text that we provide. Then if the type is equal to input and there is text, the inner HTML will be null, and there will be a placeholder with text, and it will be an actual input. And then from the parent element here, what we're going to do is we're going to say if it does have a parent element, we're going to get the document, get an element by ID of that parent element, and we're going to append this child inside of that element. Otherwise, we're going to add that element to the document body. As we go up to the function here for the create chatbot window, we can see here that we're creating lots of different elements. So the first one is the chatbot init. That's going to be a div with an ID of chatbot init and a class of chatbot init. Then we create an element, another div called chatbot. and that's going to have a class of chatbot and the chatbot type, which is the URL element type. So that would be the mini or the full. Then we're going to create another element div, and this is going to be chatbot title, and that's actually going to have a parent of the chatbot here. So this will live inside of this div here, and that will have a text of coding Nexus chatbot. Next, we have another div for a chatbot close, and that will just be the close button at the top. Then we have another element here, which is a div for the chatbot body. And these are all going to have the parent of the chatbot. So they're all going to live inside the chatbot. And then we have a chatbot footer, same again. And then inside the footer, we want to create an input that will have a class and an ID of chatbot input. And that will live inside of the chatbot footer, and the text will be ask a question. Remember that the text, if it's an input, will be classed as a placeholder. And then we have another element which will be a button with chatbot button ID and class, and that will live inside of the footer as well with text of submit. And then last but not least, we have the powered by. So you'll want to change the text inside of here to link back to your website. This will be just a div that sits below that's going to have a powered by text, and it will say powered by Coding Nexus. So that's the bulk of that part done. The next function we want to create will be to check if the user actually exists. So when a user hits the site, we want to give them a unique identifier. So the unique identifiers are stored in the local storage. It's stored as a UUID. If that item doesn't exist, what we're going to do is we're going to go to our API, and then we're going to go to the endpoint, so the new user endpoint that we created, and that's going to return a UUID for the user to have. And then that's going to just set that as an item in the local storage as a UUID, res.uuid. This API domain is using the same domain we have at the top. So that's quite a simple one. So the next function we want to create is an initialization function. So this will be triggered when the page is initialized by this function here. So inside of this initialization function, what we're doing is we're getting the variables from the URL, we're adding our styles in, we're creating the chatbot window, we're checking if the user exists, and then we're also going to inject a new message into the message box that just says, welcome, how can I help you? This message isn't used for anything. It is literally just going to be a message that sits there to say, welcome, how can I help you? We also have this download chat, which is commented out at the moment. We'll re-trigger that back in a second when we add the download chat function. So up next, we want to create a trigger for when a person clicks the send message button, and then what that's going to actually trigger. So we've got this element equals document.getElementById, the chatbot button that we created up here. So this chatbot button here. Then what we're going to do is add an event listener and listen for a click on that button. And if that button is clicked, we're going to trigger this send message function. Now this send message function is going to take the input text from the chatbot input that we created further up. Then we're also going to create an element which is going to be injected into the chatbot window. So it's going to be a type of request and message, and that's going to have the value from that. So what that does, that shows the message actually inside the message content. Then we have this scroll to bottom function that we're going to create in a second. What that's going to ensure is every time a message is put into the window, it's just going to automatically scroll to the bottom of that window. Otherwise, it will just stay at the top and all the messages will be passed underneath and the person will be scrolling. This will automatically scroll for them. So from there, we're going to create a fetch request to localhost 5000/message, which is the API point we created here. And that is going to be a post method. And the body content will be of a JSON.stringify, and that's going to take an object with message and input text.value. So that's the input text here and the value that they've typed in there. Now for security, I've added a few headers in here. We're going to have a content type of application JSON. We're going to pass back a token of a URL elements.id, a domain, and this is the domain that the person's on when they sent it back, and the user's ID. So from this, you'll be able to restrict this down to the domain levels and also down to the user levels. And you'll be able to also, if you want to, and they include a token in the URL, it's probably not the most secure way of doing it, but backed up with the domain, it's a bit more secure, where in the URL, so let's say, for example, they had this URL here, they could have $ID is equal to, and then you could have another UUID in there for them to check. And you could give that to them when they sign up. So this fetch here returns a promise, and we need to convert that promise to a JSON. So we say then, and then we take the resolve here, and we say return res.json. And then that also returns another promise where we can actually start accessing the content that comes from that. So from there, we have this create element. We're going to create a div. It's not going to have an ID. It will just have a response and a message. And it's going to be a chatbot window. That's the parent it's going to go into. And that will be the res.message that we get back from this server. So when we send the message, we return back res.message. And then obviously we're going to scroll to the bottom again, just because we've had our user's message go in, and then we've got our return message to go in. So we want that to then scroll even more. And then we're going to reset the input text to be nothing. So when we receive this message, the input text will just be wiped clean. So now that we've created the chatbot window and we've created the messaging communication between the front end and the API, we'll want to hide the actual window on first load. So let's create this chatbot init, and that's going to be equal to document.getElementById chatbot init. So if we look all the way up here, one of the first elements we created was a chatbot init, and that was just a div, which we're going to turn into a button. So what we're going to do, we're going to listen to that for a click, and on click, we're going to trigger this chatbot init function, and that will convert the chatbot window from none to a block. So it will show nothing, and then when you click on that button, it will then show it as a block. Also going to hide the chatbot init button. So the chatbot window will appear and the button will disappear. And then we want to do the same in reverse. So chatbot close, and that's going to watch for the chatbot close ID, and then it's going to add an event listener for a click, and then trigger this chatbot close function here. So close chatbot, and then it's just doing the reverse of what we have here. So rather than that being a block and none, it's going to be none and then block. So now we're going to create our scroll to bottom function. This is quite a simple function. We get to the query selector for the chatbot. We then get the query selector for the chatbot body from the chat box. And then what we want to say is chatbox.body.scroll to top is equal to the scroll height of the actual chatbot box. So what that will do, the scroll to top will scroll all the way down to the height of the bottom of the box. So we only have two functions left. Up next, we have the download chat. That's going to get all of the messages from the array of the messages inside of the document. And then we're going to just console log those out. So we're going to loop over message.forEach, and inside there, we're going to get a message. And we're just going to console log the message class. So that is whether it was a response or the user. And then we're going to get the inner HTML of that, and it's going to console log out the actual message. And then the last function will be to reset the chat. To do that, we're going to say documents.getElementById and get the chat body, and we're just going to wipe everything inside of there. The inner HTML is going to be equal to an empty string. And then we're going to recreate this element to say, welcome, how can I help you? So we can click save on that now. I'm just going to close these windows down. The last thing for us to do is to create the CSS for the front end. We have the main API working. We've tested that. The main.js we can test once we have the CSS working. Actually, we can test that now. Okay, so to test this inside of here, we've got our JS main.js. We're going to put a question mark type is equal to mini. Then that should stop us getting any errors on the front end. So if we refresh now, we can see that we have our content here. Now, obviously, we haven't got any CSS in here at the moment, but as soon as we add the CSS in, that should start working. So you can see we've got all our content here. Right, so for the CSS, I'll be using SCSS. if you haven't got that installed on your machine, if you go to scss.lang.com and /install, it will tell you how to install that on your machine. So you can do that here, npm install -g, then SaaS. That should work absolutely fine. So inside the CSS folder here, I'm going to create a new folder called SCSS, and that will just contain the SCSS. I'm going to have a new file in there called chatbot.scss. Then outside of this, inside the CSS file, we're going to have a new file. That's just going to be called styles.scss. That's where we're going to import the main content from this chatbot.scss. So we open up a new terminal window here and we run SaaS and then the location of our SCSS file. So that'd be css/styles.scss. Then we do a colon and then the location of where we want the output to be. So that'll be css/styles.min.css. And then we want to do -w to watch it. And then I'm going to do --style compressed. And we can see that it's watching this for changes now. So inside the styles.scss file, what we want to do is include the location to our CSS chatbot file. And also I'm going to import the fonts for Roboto from Google API. Okay, for some reason that's not actually watching. Error reading, no such file or directory. Okay. Right, so it's actually external /css.styles.css and then external /css styles.min.css. And then I'm going to put the compressed back on the end there. There we go, that should be working now. So I'm just going to test that that is compressing. So that is compressing, good. Okay, let's close that down. Close that down. All we need open at the moment is the chatbot.scss file. So I'm going to import this file and then explain to you what's happening inside of it because it's quite a large file. So starting at the top here, we initialize the chatbot. We have a font family of Roboto sans serif and a display of none. That's so we can change this display to a block later. Then inside we have a chatbot title, chatbot body, chatbot footer with a width of 100%. And we're going to display block on those. Then we have .mini. So we have our full screen one here, but it's empty. So inside the mini, I'm going to give it a box shadow. So it pulls the screen at any time to copy some of this. We have a width of 350 pixels, a height of 50 view height, a max height of 400 pixels. So if the 50 view height was 700 pixels, the minimum height of that box would still be 400 pixels. You can alter this if you want. The border radius of 5 pixels. We're going to have a bottom of 25 pixels, so it's not sitting all the way on the bottom, and a right of 25 pixels, so it's not sitting up against the right. And the position is going to be absolute, so it's going to position itself on the right bottom. The chatbot title, we're going to have a 50 pixel line height, a font size of 20 pixels. Text align is going to be centered, a color of white, a background of a dark blue. Change this to match your style. So we have a border radius of 5 pixels by 5 pixels and then 0 and 0 for top, right, bottom and left. We're also going to give it a border of 0.5 pixels solid and then the same blue that I have for the background. We can actually change these to variables if you wanted to, but I didn't do that in this one. So the chatbot close is just going to be an X. So we're going to position that absolute, and that's going to have a top of 5 pixels, a right of 8 pixels, and a cursor of pointer. So when we hover over it, the cursor changes to a pointer. And then the before content is just going to be an X, as we explained, and the color of white, because that's going to be sitting on that blue background. The chatbot body is going to have a height of 100% minus 100 pixels. That's to calculate for the header and the footer. It's going to have a padding of 5%. The overflow Y is going to be auto. So as the messages continue, people can scroll up and down. Overflow X, on the other hand, is going to be hidden. The border left and border right will have these values here. So just a nice solid border on the left and right. And a width of 100% minus 10 pixels. That's to calculate for the scroll bar. Now the request and response, so the request is the message the user sends out, the response is the message the user gets back. So we want to have those slightly different colors so we can differentiate between those quite easily. So the request and response, we're going to capture both of those and give those a 5 pixel margin, a padding of 5 pixels by 10 pixels, a border radius of 5 pixels, a width of 100% minus 40 pixels, a border of 0.5 blue, and a font size of 14 pixels. The response then will have a background of blue and a color of white, and the request will have a color of blue and text line to write. The background will automatically be white on that. The chatbot footer will have a height of 40 pixels. And we're going to display flex for this because we want to have the input field and then the button on the right. It's going to have a width of 100%. The chatbot input will have a width of calc 100% minus 50 pixels. That's for the space for the button. And a padding left of 10 pixels. So it's not, the text inside the input isn't pushing right up against the left-hand side. It's got a nice little padding. We're also going to give that a border radius of 0, 0, 0, and 5 pixels. Now the chatbot button will have a background of blue and a color of white, so the font is on a blue background. The cursor will be pointer, as mentioned earlier. When we hover over, it tells the user that this is actually an actionable element. And then we have a border radius of 0, 0, 5 pixels, and 0. The full screen is empty. Then we have a powered by, which has a font size of 12 pixels and a margin top of 8 pixels. That's to sit on the left-hand side underneath the box. Now what we have left is the chatbot init. That's the button that's going to appear before the person clicks and it disappears and the chatbot actually shows on screen. So that will have a box shadow, a font family of Roboto, a width of 75 pixels, a background of blue, a color of white, a border radius of 5 pixels. So we're literally turning this into a button. It's going to be 25 pixels from the bottom, 25 pixels from the right, and position absolute. And that's going to be a cursor pointer again to show it's actionable. So the before content will be chat. So this is the content that's going to be inside of the box, the text. So it will say chat. Change that to what you want, to support or help or anything you like. It will have a line height of 40 pixels, a width of 75 pixels. We're going to center align that and display that as a box. So if I hit save on that, we can see it's just compiled. And now when we open up our index.html file, so let me reveal that in Finder and open that up. So we can now see we have a button on the bottom right hand side. If we click that, that will open up the window. And we have got a little powered by Coding Nexus at the bottom there. And we have our Coding Nexus chatbot. And this is the welcome text that we wrote. And we can ask it a question. So we can say, what is 10 plus 10? For example, submit. And then we get our response back from the AI. So in this video, we created a chatbot that can be accessed externally. In the upcoming video, I'll show you how to create a system where users can log into and actually get API keys. They can edit how the chatbot looks for them, and they can personalize it for their business. I'll also show you how they can add their own API key for OpenAI. This way you can actually just sell your system as the service and they pay for anything that comes through for the OpenAI side. If you found this video useful, consider hitting the subscribe button. Also, check out this video here to learn more about ChatGPT. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.